All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I know our presenters have a lot of information and content for you. But what I would just love to do first is welcome you. You know, we certainly couldn't put these on without your participation and your continued support. And we really, really hope that you continue coming to our anniversary webinar series. So I don't want to spend a ton of time introducing. So I think what I'm going to do is just pass it off to Kelsey. I think each of our presenters are going to introduce themselves, how they're affiliated with CASA, who they are, and then they'll get into the meat and potatoes of their presentation. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming today.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kelsey Hill. I work for the Department of Children and Families. I'll do a quick intro and then pass it on to my colleagues and then circle back and do my part of the presentation. So thanks for being with us today. I'm excited to have you all learn about independent living. I am the Independent Living Coordinator with DCF. I work in our Bureau of Youth Services, which I'll talk a little bit about when I speak more in just a bit. And I've been in this position a little over 4 years. So I look forward to the opportunity to teach you a little bit and to learn a little bit more about CASA as well. So I will pass it on to Sarah Clapper. You three can do your introductions and then pass it back to me and I will do my portion.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kelsey. Good afternoon, everyone. I have to say I'm super excited. Just before everyone kind of logged on, she had shared with us how many people were registered for the session today. So we're super excited to be here. But as Kelsey said, my name is Sarah Clapper. I am the Deputy Program Operations Manager for the Bay Area Workforce Development Board. And so we are the transitional resource agency, the regional provider for independent living services over the age of 18 for Northeast Wisconsin. Our office is located in Green Bay, but our county service region extends from Florence County down to Wapaka and east. And then I will hand it over to Taylor and Megan.
Megan, you want to go first or you want me to?
Sure, I just didn't want to talk over you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Megan Weicker, and I am an independent living coordinator in Brown County. So I work for Family Services of Northeast Wisconsin, but I am contracted through the Bay Area Workforce Development Board. So Brown County is one of the areas that they oversee independent living. Go ahead, Taylor.
My name is Taylor Connell, and I'm the Senior Advocate Supervisor at CASA Brown County. I work primarily with our teenagers through our Fostering Futures program and work closely with Megan and Sarah with aging out of care. I think it's Kelsey now.
All right, so the four of us will work through today's content. You'll understand, hopefully in a little bit more about the layers of independent living. You just got a whole bunch of introductions and some sort of sneak peek to the different agencies and sort of people we have involved with this service program. So what I would say is if you can make sure you're muted, that'd be really helpful just so there's no background noise. I will work through my presentation, so I'll share my screen in just a bit. And if you could hold questions until the end of my portion, that would be helpful, just because sometimes if they come up during the presentation or are put into the chat, it gets a little bit discombobulated. So I'll make sure to pause at the end of my portion before we move on to Sarah, Megan, and Taylor presenting their portion as well. So I'm super excited to have them here with me today. They can speak a lot more to sort of on the ground work for independent living, specifically about where CASA sort of fits into the equation. So I will share my screen right now and we'll get started. Oops, that is the wrong thing. Hold on. Inevitably, right? Like have it all queued up and then something else happens. Try again. I think after 1.5 years, I would have this done pat. So hopefully that's the right thing. You should see Wisconsin Independent Living Program overview for CASA in today's state. So as I said, I am the Independent Living Coordinator with the Department of Children and Families, and I'll just step through a little bit more about what that means, sort of where we're situated in the department, what independent living is, who it serves, that type of thing. So I'm situated in the Bureau of Youth Services, which is the smallest and newest bureau within our department. So it's the only portion of DCF that is explicitly meant to serve adolescents. So DCF as a whole is really focused on serving families, a lot of focus on prevention services, young children, things like that. But we are the only team that's really dedicated to serving vulnerable youth populations. And that could be young people who interact with a variety of systems or maybe just one system a number of different ways. And I'll walk through in just a bit sort of what the key players are in our bureau. But as you can see on this slide, we were created in 2013, so not even a full decade old yet, with a specific focus on providing comprehensive services and support to vulnerable youth populations. So the visual on this page is from our youth services framework, which is linked at the bottom of the slide, and you are welcome to click into when you wish. But really with the foundation that we understand there are sort of core things that all young people need to succeed, particularly those who are vulnerable and underserved. So foundational elements are connections and well-being. Then there are certain outcomes that we really want to have young people excel in as they transition to young adulthood, such as education success, employment success, housing stability, those types of things. And there's the whole core principle of right service at right time. So we very much have our work framed by the idea that there's no wrong door for young people who need help to enter to hopefully be able to receive that help, recognizing that there's overlap in the systems in the populations that we are interacting with on a daily basis. And that certainly drives what's at the top of our house, which is the whole idea that youth thrive, right? So individualized to them and to their situations, how can our interventions really get them to the point where they are thriving as young adults and onward? So specific to youth who age out of home care, this is probably not news to any of you because I know that you're interacting with these populations on a daily basis, but those young people are at a higher risk of homelessness, unemployment, underemployment, incarceration, and other negative outcomes, which I'll touch upon in the next slide. So that really drives the work, particularly in regards to independent living, which is targeted towards individuals who spent time in care as adolescents. So the challenge, which I just alluded to a little bit on the prior slide, is that the young people who are spending time in foster care, which we synonymously refer to as out-of-home care, do not fare particularly well, especially if they spent time in care as a teenager, and particularly if they have aged out of the system, quote unquote, which is that they exited care at age 18 or older. So I won't go through all of these statistics on this slide, and certainly this is not exhaustive. You could pick any number of metrics and you sort of see a similar narrative in each of them, but this outlines the challenge, right? What drives our work and sort of what's at the foundation of having a dedicated program like independent living, which is that nationally, looking at that data as well as Wisconsin specific data and a number of metrics, 4 of which are listed here, there's just poor outcomes for this population. So as I said, historically underemployed, have the same ambitions to pursue post-secondary education, but don't necessarily have the same retention or success in that area, unstable housing situations, prevalence of mental health issues, things like that. So this really, I think is pretty illustrative of what we see with our population and why we work so hard to try to combat it. So this information is linked at the bottom of the slide, should you want to go and dive in a little bit deeper and see what the resources are and what some other metrics say. So before I get into independent living more specifically, just want to do a quick breakdown. As I said, this lives within BYS, so you can sort of see what our whole spectrum of service provision looks like. So we have a very small but mighty team of about 11 people working on some pretty high needs, nuanced programs across the state. So Brighter Future programming is meant to address substance abuse issues amongst adolescent population. We have runaway and homeless youth programming, youth justice, anti-human trafficking, and then independent living, which we also refer to as IL. And there's about 1.5 of us who support that IL program. So as you will see in my presentation in the next portion that Sarah, Megan, and Taylor will speak to, is we have a sort of a bifurcated IL system. So we have the system and the service provision while young people are in care, either through a county or a tribe. And then we have our regional partners who administer the program for youth who qualify after leaving care. So 1.5 people at DCF support all of that. And in my role, I should say, I primarily work with the transition resource agencies, who are those regional partners providing services to youth after they've left care. So independent living, by definition, is rooted in an individual being placed in court-ordered, qualifying, out-of-home care, again, used synonymously with the term foster care, while an adolescent. This is a federally funded and directed and administered program, so we only get federal funds. We don't have any state contribution to this program right now. And the parameters for what qualifies as out-of-home care is dictated by what is within the federal definition of federal care, or foster care rather. So it could be a foster home, it could be a group home, an RCC, court-ordered kinship, a number of things. So it's not every type of out-of-home placement, but it is a large portion of them according to the federal definition. So our allocation is on an annual basis, and it's primarily driven by a calculation that the feds have of determining the number of youth who are in out-of-home care, doing some math, and then determining what of the national allocation will come to our state. So Wisconsin, we are unique in two ways, in that we have a county administered child welfare system, and we also have a two-tiered independent living system. So only a handful of states have county administered child welfare. The majority of states have a state administered system, which I would think would be quite curious, just knowing that I've only worked in this system to know how that would function. And as I said before, we have a two-tiered independent living program. So we have different partners serving IL eligible youth, depending on whether they're in care or if they continue to qualify after leaving care. So for a young person to be eligible, you can view our full eligibility guide, which is at the bottom of the slide. I will share out this resource after today's training so that it can be passed along to those who registered if that's something that CASA wants to do. But just in brief, eligibility for a young person to qualify for independent living while they're under county or tribal care means that they had to have been in court-ordered out-of-home care for at least 6 months after the age of 14. So that's the magic number that the feds came up with, recognizing that we're talking about, full-fledged teenagers at that point. So that's the most common way in which young people become eligible. We have a smaller subset of young people who become eligible automatically when they enter out-of-home care, again, court-ordered, a qualifying placement type, when they enter that placement at age 17 and a half, or they turn 17 and a half at that time, or in that placement. The intent of that is because we recognize a lot of young people leave care at 18 and they don't necessarily have the amount of time to accumulate that necessary 6 months to sort of turn on the eligibility flag. In both situations, the young person is eligible for as long as they remain in a qualifying care setting. So if they were to go home for a while or to transition to a placement type that does not qualify, their eligibility would turn off, but it would sort of kick back into place should they re-enter a qualifying placement type again. And I'll speak a little bit more further down the line of what all sort of the requirements and expectations are for serving a young person while they qualify for IL in care. In this, when a young person qualifies, the intent of independent living is that it's youth driven. It should be incremental, it should be tailored to them, should be very much, framed by their voice and their preferences as much as possible. And it must be interwoven with other child welfare requirements. So that includes permanency planning that's happening, any transition planning that's occurring, considerations of the youth circumstances, network, family dynamics, all that type of stuff. So it's meant to be definitely incorporated with the rest of the child welfare system. For a young person to continue their eligibility after they've left care and to be served by a transition resource agency, we have Region 2 here today, so that's Sarah and the other two individuals. They could potentially be served by the TRAs, which is what we call them, sort of shorthand, if they aged out of court-ordered out-of-home care. So again, that placement type matters. Them being in that placement type on their 18th birthday or after is very important. If a young person is reunified very close to their 18th birthday, for example, their eligibility would have ended and they wouldn't have qualified, sort of regardless of what their prior placement history had been. So that's the most frequent circumstance in which young people retain their eligibility after leaving care. We also have a smaller subset of individuals who continue to be eligible through a TRA after entering Chapter 48.977 guardianship after the age of 16. So this is something that, again, was prescribed by the feds. That age 16 is sort of a line in the sand that they made. So that's another way that young people can qualify for regional services. And additionally, we do have a small set of the population that is adopted after the age of 16 following time in out-of-home care, who would retain eligibility following being placed out of home. So I think I neglected to say this before, but being served by a county or tribe, that's the responsibility of those child welfare agencies, so long as the young person is on an order and still in care. So even if they're in extended care, which is very small and limited in Wisconsin, but does exist, they continue to be the responsibility of that CWA, of that child welfare agency. The TRA only picks up responsibility, if and when the young person is off an order and sort of checks these eligibility boxes. TRAs serve young people up to the age of 21 primarily. Some services go up to the age of 23, and those are specific to post-secondary supports. And actually at this time, because there's sort of an unconventional situation with some stimulus funding, the TRAs do have temporary permission to be providing overall IL supports to age 23, but that is just temporary for the moment until something more substantive changes with our eligibility. Similar to being in care and being served through independent living, this is meant to be youth driven. A big difference with the TRAs is that it's voluntary participation. So at the county or with the tribe, independent living is a requirement that workers have to integrate into other work that they're doing with the young person. Once the young person is off an order, they are an adult, they are on their own, they can choose whether or not to engage with the TRAs and to what degree they do that. So we have some young people who do it sort of the full spectrum of supports, and we have others who maybe just get one support once in a while and then choose to disengage. Sorry. So this resource is probably fairly small for you, so I apologize for that, but the link is at the bottom. So again, this is something you can check out after the fact. But this is just meant to provide an example of some resources that we have related to independent living. And I think it's particularly helpful because it goes over the whole continuum, right? So we talk a lot about sort of in care versus out of care. And this is a really good job of weaving those all together and how independent living is meant to build upon itself, how it's meant to be incremental to the young person. That might be based on age, maturity level, motivation, whatever it might be. So no two sort of independent living scenarios will look the same for any two youth. This is something a colleague of mine who supports independent living did in concert with 2 young adult consultants, which is pretty awesome. So it includes requirements as well as best practices and recommendations. And you'll notice that even though, as I mentioned, independent living primarily runs from 14 to 21, 23 on occasion, this actually goes from 13 to 26, and that's intentional. We did it all the way down to 13 because something we always like to mention, which I will mention here today, is that even if a young person was in out-of-home care for just 1 day after the age of 13, they can qualify for independent student status when they complete their FAFSA prior to going to college. Or to a post-secondary program. So we try to make that clear to as many audiences as we can who are interacting with this population, because we know that's something that's not always well understood. So that's why it goes down to 13 and it goes up to 26, because young people who spent time in foster care do qualify for Badger care through the age of 26 in Wisconsin. So definitely take a moment to look that over in more detail. You can certainly zoom into that and see more what the specific boxes say. So, computer's going slowly, here we go. So I think I mentioned that we have a Region 2 partners here today. So from the Bay Area Workforce Development Board, they serve Northeast Wisconsin. This slide shows what these service areas are. So we have 7 TRAs throughout the state. These are different than other DCF regions. So that's what's sort of frustrating, is there's not a lot of uniformity in our department. But these are what we call youth services regions. The TRAs are not the only partners that are bound by these borders, but they are one of the few that actually serve the entire designated service area. Other partners sort of do a subset of the areas. So this is a portion of a larger map, which is available via the first link on this page. Also, what I include on here is important contact information. So if you click on the first link here, or the second link rather, you can find out in a given county or tribe who is the independent living point of contact. So some counties have a distinct independent living coordinator who, they take on those young people once their eligibility turns on. So they're primarily serving, teenagers. Other counties have it be a subset of a person's caseload. And I would say there's pros and cons to both of those, but certainly the dynamic and working with them and sort of familiarity with IL will vary a little bit just depending on how they have it structured in their agency. If you go to the third link, this is where you can find the contact information for the TRA. So for Region 2, Sarah is pretty much that person because they're structured a little bit differently in that they subcontract with a number of different staff members who are scattered throughout the region. But they primarily have things go through Sarah, and then she sort of directs them to the appropriate person. But that is to say, Region 2 today is an example of a TRA in the state, but there's a lot of variability across the state in terms of what agency types are, how they're structured, who their points of contact might be. So if you ever have any questions, you can certainly direct them to me. My contact information is on the last slide, but also you can use this link to be able to sort through the regions and figure out who is best to contact. All right, so getting into the meat of this a little bit. So I'll speak more to what service delivery looks like at both levels. So at the child welfare agency level, so the CWA level, the counties use their child and family allocation to pay for direct services to eligible young people between the ages of 14 and 21, again, while they're in out-of-home care. So predominantly it'll end at 18, but in some circumstances, the young person will be in care a little bit longer to complete high school or to be in extended care. Then there's 5 tribes of the 11 in Wisconsin who receive JFE funding. So that's the federal funding for this program. They receive that to pay for direct services for eligible youth ages 14 to 21. So they have a lot of discretion to choose the subpopulation that they want to serve. It might be sort of a single year or a couple of years within that 14 to 21 age range. They can also focus on areas of focus that are most relevant to their population. Tribal youth do have the option to engage with both their county and their tribe, or both their tribe and their TRA if they so choose, which is sort of a unique situation for them. Usually we don't have sort of that cross-pollination as much, but that's the acknowledgement that tribal youth may have certain things that are best met by their tribal agency, and then other things that might be best met by either their county or TRA partners. So there's sort of this triangle here for those young people, and the different agencies along with the young person can sort of determine how they're best served in different areas. So the requirements for independent living are outlined in our DCF ongoing services standards as well as statute. So just in brief, I won't go into all the details, but there's a few key things that they need to do that workers need to be doing at the child welfare agency level. So at the start of an individual's eligibility, they have to be doing an independent living assessment and a plan. The assessment is usually either the Casey or the Daniel Memorial. And they're using that assessment to identify what are the IL needs, goals, challenges, that type of thing for the young person. So independent living is a broad term that's really meant to identify what is needed for this young person to be self-sufficient and stable as a young adult, right? So in the areas of health or employment, education, housing, all those types of things, what do they need development and assistance with before they're out on their own, in short. So that plan is meant to be evolving. So it should be updated on an ongoing basis in tandem with permanency planning and those types of things. The worker should also be securing youth's important documents, so the youth has access to those, particularly when they transition from care. And then there is an ILTD plan, also known as Independent Living Transition to Discharge Plan, which needs to be done when a young person is set to age out of care. So again, those are the youth who are most often served by the TRAs. And the CWA worker takes the lead on facilitating any necessary meetings to develop that plan, making sure there's a good representation sort of at that table, whether it's a virtual table or a real table, of the people who are supportive in the youth's life and can help them achieve the goals that are discussed as part of that plan development. The meetings and the plan itself should be youth focused and youth driven. There might be a need for more than one of them depending on the young person and what their situation is. The ILTD is crucial, but it's also, I would say, misunderstood and sort of underutilized. So we've put a lot of work in the last year and a half or so of putting together an overview video, which is linked here. It's something you could also view in your free time, just to get a better understanding of what the ILTD is, how it's dictated by standards and statute, and walks through like what the different fields are and sort of example language to include in there. Because this might be a really good opportunity for CASAs to be involved is during this ILTD development, just because you're familiar with the young person and you can sort of speak to what they have achieved, what they have worked on, and what their ultimate goals are moving forward. Tribes are sovereign, they complete parallel processes. So just a caveat there. So TRA service delivery, they're in the position to create what we call a pro-youth network of resources and partners to aid the young person. So when the young person chooses to engage with them, some resources may be in-house, maybe facilitated or supported in that way, but most of the time they're connecting with community partners and other referral sources to meet a youth's needs. So really they're meant to put together sort of who's that community, who's that collection of partners who can help them serve the young people. They're in the position to share that information to counties and tribes while a youth is in care. So again, counties and tribes have funding, they have the responsibility to serve those youth in care, but TRAs can be a source of support, knowledge sharing, leveraging connections, that type of thing. They should also be an active participant in the youth transition from care. So again, attending those meetings, talking about their program, trying to incentivize the young person to be involved because it is voluntary. They also facilitate a regional youth advisory council, which I won't go into in a lot of depth, but that's a good opportunity for young people to be in a community of peers, to be working on advocacy and leadership skill development. And each of our regions is required to have one of those, which then feed up to a statewide YAC as well. And I already mentioned this, but they provide services to eligible youth up to the age of 21, 23 for one of them, which is called Brighter Stars. Brighter Star, primarily in the area of education, employment, housing, health and well-being, and connections. So it could be a whole gamut of things, and there's certainly other areas of focus that are not listed there, which come up a lot too, like transportation, financial literacy, those types of things. So I'll probably breeze through this because I know I'm running short on time and don't want to get into the weeds too much. But this is just meant to emphasize that this is meant to be a collaborative process, right? So it's a pretty heavy lift to figure out a roadmap for a young person who's leaving care. Certainly a CWA having been connected with them for however many years and a TRA assuming that responsibility. That's something we want to have be deliberate and thoughtful. So there should be collaboration happening during transition meeting. There should be helpful information exchange happening at that time through a combination of direct contact, these transition meetings, having information up to date in our EWIS-ACFA system, which is our database, and having the TRA worker be in a good position to sort of pick up the ball and run with serving the young person. So knowing what have they worked on, what are their wants, their needs, their goals, what triggers exist that the new worker should be informed of, and that type of thing. I think I already said this, which is TRA should be an active participant in those transition meetings. They should be familiar with the young person, sort of where they've been, where they want to go next, and be in a position to be sharing out information about their own program and how it can meet those next steps for the young person. So the ILTD is outlined in Chapter 48 and Chapter 938. So independent living, as I said, is rooted in a young person being placed out of home at a certain age for a certain amount of time, in a qualifying placement type. It doesn't matter so much if they're there for child welfare reasons or YJ reasons, youth justice reasons. So we always want to make a point that this is stipulated in both those chapters. And then our DCF ongoing service standards, which I already mentioned before, goes into more detail in terms of what the ILTD should include, because federal and state law are fairly vague, and the DCF has taken the role to spell it out a bit more. So the ILTD and sort of the overall transition process of bringing all these key players to the table for the young person is to really make sure that there's safety and stability, hopefully on the other end of that process, right? It can be rather jolting for a young person to leave a systemized existence with workers that they've been connected to for a long time, any number of reasons, in a society that sees them as being an adult, right? Because they're 18 years old now. And so the ILTD, even just the process of having those conversations and letting those ideas germinate is really helpful, even if they don't necessarily look back at that tangible piece of paper again. It is meant to provide them with success after leaving care and have a concrete plan of who will help them achieve that. So youth need plans that are comprehensive, flexible, detailed, and specific based on where they are and where they want to go, and has a solid foundation. So sometimes something we've been trying to hammer home with the ILTD is that it's not so much just saying what is the need in an area, but who are the active participants who are going to help them get there. So what is the timeline? Are there people in their network who can help them achieve that? Do those people know that they're expected to do those things, right? That they're expected to sort of be called up to bat to help. So that might be something that you and your roles can be able to flesh out and help support. One thing I want to mention real briefly, because I think this may also be a place where CASAS can be helpful, so some familiarity would be good, is that there is not an exact one-to-one between independent living and what we call the National Youth in Transition Database Survey, but there is a lot of overlap in young people qualifying for IL as well as NIDed. So this survey is a federal requirement that states are expected to fulfill to be surveying young people who are 17 years old while in care, to just ask them, how are you faring in any number of areas, right? So education, familial relationships, housing, those types of things. And that's meant to create a baseline population that's again surveyed at 19 and 21. So the idea here is to have a longitudinal and really robust amount of information and data that can inform, some of those metrics I talked about earlier, which is how is this population faring, at sort of the end of their time in care, as well as the few years after. And this has been primary to directing decisions at the state level. So the regions were really born out of NIDed as well as at the federal level. And so young people, if you hear about NIDed or you're, in a meeting it's discussed or something like that, really encourage the young people that you're connected to complete this. It's incredibly valuable in terms of the data that it provides and getting this like direct feedback from the young people themselves. And also they are compensated for their time. So whatever motivates the young person, whether it's sort of the value of contributing to the data or the compensation, or both, that's great, but they will get $20 when they complete the survey. And it's relatively quick, I believe, and it's also anonymous. So no results will be connected back to a young person, and it is really important. So wanted to make a plug because I know there's overlap in terms of the youth you may be interacting with. And there's a website here you can visit for some more information. So I blew through my portion because I really want to be able to get to Region 2 and allow them to speak to like on the ground, how does this function, right? How does CASA fit into the equation? How are they serving young people? So here's one more slide with some additional resources. So I definitely encourage you to check this out once you get this PDF in hand. I'm available for any questions you might have or consultation. As I said, I work with the TRAs very closely, but we work closely as a team, me and my counterparts. So no question is a dumb question. If you're not sure if it goes to sort of the county IL person compared to the TRA IL person, it's not a big deal. We can certainly help. So I will stop sharing. I will stop talking. And I just want to see if anybody has any questions for me at this time. And maybe made your brain explode.
The one question I had, you answered, Kelsey, about cross eligibility for other programs like Badger Care.
Yep, great. We know that's not a super youth-friendly system. We're trying to work with DHS to improve things like that, similar to like DVR. We're trying to increase our collaboration across state agencies too, but I'm glad that was helpful.
So Kelsey, do you coordinate with school districts? And I know some students are special education, they are on IEPs, and they're also required to have transition plans.
Correct. Yeah. So I don't know if Region 2 wants to speak at all about, how schools are part of a youth transition process, but I would say certainly while a young person is in care, there'll be some degree of collaboration that's happening with their school district. If a young person has an IEP, for example, they're still pursuing high school and they're under the age of 21, they can stay in care until 21. So that's the parameters for extended care in Wisconsin. But we certainly are working with DPI and other partners to do similar things as today, right? To better educate them on how a young person qualifies, to make sure that everyone knows what IL eligibility is and what people might be able to access. Because the more we can sort of cross-pollinate, the more we can make sure that these young people are being identified and we're sort of wrapping around them. So I would say it probably varies place to place, but there is definitely some overlap that's happening there. But Sarah, I see you're unmuted if you want to add anything.
I unmuted to get ready for my portion.
Sorry.
I think you said it well. I don't know, Megan or Taylor, if you have anything to add specifically, but I think to your point, Kelsey, that really every region, every staff, every school district kind of operates a little bit different, but that we are very well closely connected with our school districts. And so, there's frequent communication from both sides.
Yeah. Absolutely, what you guys both said is correct, and it really depends on the individual youth. If they identify somebody that they're working with at their school level as a trusted adult and somebody that's important to be part of their transition plan, then we absolutely invite them to be involved in meetings and communicate with whoever it would be appropriate for them to be communicating that information along to, just because a lot of times that graduation and after school plan plays a huge role in the plans that we're making on our end for them. So with some kids, there's a lot of school involvement, and with others, not so much. It kind of just depends on what's appropriate for that situation.
Well put.
Just a quick question, Kelsey. You mentioned that, or one of the slides showed that it was required to have these services in certain situations. How do you identify what kids it's required for and contact them initially?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when a young person is in care, if they're, that right age, they're over the age of 14, they have the cumulative amount of time of 6 months in that qualifying placement setting in eWisAquis, which is the database that our county child welfare agency partners use, they are flagged. So there's literally like an indicator that pops up on their record in the system saying this young person is eligible now. And there's ticklers, that we call them ticklers, notifications that go along with that, which is saying, this young person is now eligible. You need to complete an IL plan. You need to do an IL assessment. And then there'll be a similar prompt for like the ILTD on the back end, if they're aging out of care, and will qualify for that too. The tribes, it's a little bit more manual. They don't work in eWisAquis, so they have a different tracking system, which will be specific to their agency. But they also have typically smaller populations, so it can be a little bit easier to track that way. So that's meant to drive it. And then the TRAs have a master list of young people who qualify, depending on their service area, and they use that to direct their outreach and making sure they're part of the transition process. So hopefully that answered your question, but it's largely driven by our database, with, I would say, some people just keeping their eye on it too, because it doesn't always function perfectly. So
okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions I can answer? Well, I'll hand it off. I went over time. I apologize. But I would say if you are working with a county partner or have young people you suspect may be eligible, start those conversations. Just see if this is happening. It could be something that would be relevant for you to be pulled in as a support for that young person as well. So I'm going to hand it off to Sarah, Taylor, and Megan and let them proceed. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. I will stay on for the rest of the meeting too.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelsey. So I apologize in advance. I'm going to talk quick so that Megan and Taylor can have the bulk of the time at the end. And I anticipate that there's likely going to be, a lot of questions kind of specific to their portion. So I want to make sure there's enough time for that. But so as Kelsey mentioned, there are 7 regions across the state of Wisconsin that administer the independent living program from the age of 18 to 21. And so for the purpose of the presentation today, The information will be applicable across the state of Wisconsin, but there will be key aspects kind of pulled in just from our experience specific to Region 2. So I will be sure to mention that. Overall, I'll kind of be touching base specifically on what services are available, the opportunities through the Brighter Star program, discussing the Youth Advisory Council, and then Megan and Taylor will be sharing a couple real life on the ground scenarios, and then we'll get into questions. So again, as Kelsey mentioned, the 5 primary pillars or the foundation of our IL program are focused on those 5 key points up on the orange there. And so really it's critical for each of these components to be present in a young person's life. And so we do our best to try to ensure that we provide the comprehensive wraparound services, excuse me, to assist in one or all the domains if needed. In addition to those 5 kind of key pillars, there really are additional services and skills, and Kelsey mentioned some of them as well, that make up and prepare a young person to be successful in housing or education. And so those services are really not limited to financial literacy, development of work readiness skills, post-secondary prep, conversations on lease agreements and assistance with apartment searching, all those things, and also financial assistance where it's deemed needed. So all of those things and many more are provided directly by their case manager. And so, for example, as Megan in Brown County here, she is introduced prior to the ILTD meeting that occurs at the age of 17 and a half. And so, in my opinion, a strength of our program, especially in Region 2, is that there's an early introduction of our staff around the age of 17 or even earlier. And so really this allows young people to become familiar with, begin forming that relationship. And so when the youth does turn 18, it's really a seamless transition. The young person feels comfortable going to this person with any concerns or needs, and also feels safe in learning and receiving guidance from them. And so Kelsey provided a lot of information on the ILTD process, and Taylor and Megan will be sharing a little bit more on how that looks in a real life scenario, and where I think your involvement and expertise would be really important to the process. And so as this is a voluntary program, really the entire basis of this is youth driven. So we strive to assist young people at where they're at and assist them in learning and developing those skills to get them in where they want to be. Most of the regional agencies and contracted providers throughout the state have a lot of additional internal programs that allow for a seamless referral, and whether that's FSET or W2, I know I'm throwing out some acronyms, but food pantries, counseling, or crisis services, this allows staff to be able to comprehensively provide all the services that an individual may need when they transition out of care. So really our IL coordinators are the subject matter experts on their community, the resources that are available, and they have the partnerships with those key stakeholders, such as the school districts that are involved with our youth and young adult programming. So a piece of the before mentioned services and opportunities for young people eligible for this program is the opportunity to attend post-secondary training. As Kelsey briefly mentioned, the Brighter Star program. So young people that are eligible for independent living are also eligible to receive assistance through Brighter Star up to the age of 23. And so this is a program that provides financial assistance to support those that are pursuing a post-secondary training at an accredited or pre-accredited program. And so those are listed there, whether that's a 4-year degree, 2-year short-term training. And so we treat this really similarly to a scholarship program. An application is submitted with an optional essay, and they receive a formal letter of acceptance. And so the funds are really tailored to meet each individual and their needs. So some students utilize it strictly for transportation assistance and childcare. Some utilize it as a hybrid of tuition, books, and equipment needs. And some utilize it for their dorm or rent costs for the school year. So the student or the youth that we're working with works directly with the IL coordinator in conjunction with school advisors to navigate FAFSA, scholarships, to really get the best support in any of those gaps that they may have. Specifically for this program, it's an expectation that the student maintains a 2.0 GPA in order to continue receiving funding, and they're held to that. If a student doesn't maintain a 2.0, they are required to complete an appeal process until they are able to increase their GPA to that requirement. This is really a good opportunity for those youth that feel that post-secondary is not an option for them financially. And needless to say, a lot of work and preparation takes place prior to a young person entering post-secondary. A lot of support is needed throughout, and we do our best to ensure that young people have a safe, stable place to call home. They have enough food and clothes, any of other basic needs are met, but as well as having prepared and developed the skills necessary to succeed in a post-secondary environment. Again, as Kelsey mentioned before, each of the 7 regions in Wisconsin have their own structure of youth advisory councils. If not one, they may have multiple based on the layout and structure of their region. So here is a quick snapshot of a flyer of Region 2 here in Northeast Wisconsin. And so it just provides a glimpse into what is involved with the YAC, what they can expect, information about when and where. And so these groups represent youth from the ages of 14 to 26 who are supported through an advisor. So I myself am an advisor for Region 2. But ultimately, groups are led by the youth and initiatives that are important to them. So the youth develop the agenda, they facilitate the meeting, they determine the direction that the group would like to head in. And so this is really an opportunity, and it's essential that the youth feel supported. While trying to be mindful as adult supporters to not be overpowering in the room with them, but just as important to debrief and allow for that space following the meeting to talk through their experience and what they're going through. And so within our region, we always share a meal together. It's kind of a fun way to bring everyone together, of course, food. And that's just something that we kind of form around the basis of our meetings. So we always start with meal and introductions, but it's a good way for young people to get involved. On the next slide here, if any of you are interested, I threw on the regional YAC advisors for across the state. And so I think, as Kelsey kind of touched on before, there's representatives from our local youth advisory councils that then make up the state youth advisory council. And so this is a group that meets 6 times a year and is supported directly by Department of Children and Family staff. And so this is really a further opportunity for them to develop their skills as a leader and have an impact directly on policy and change in the child welfare system. These young people are advocates for all of those in foster care and have had the opportunity to be involved in trainings, both take part in and facilitate, such as strategic sharing trainings, panel opportunities with local organizations or foster parents, community fundraisers, volunteering events. And so a lot of the individuals that are members on the state YAC have also been able to travel across the country, attending conferences, trainings, taking part in internships. And so it's given them an opportunity to get out of their small town, to see beyond the state of Wisconsin and hear from other foster youth across the country. Ultimately, the local and state youth advisory council provides youth with a platform to amplify their voice and represent the voices of other foster youth to have an impact on the child welfare system. I promise this is my last slide. Within Region 2, specifically in Brown County here, with Taylor and Megan on the call, we have a very close relationship with CASA and several other community providers that we are working directly with that are providing or working hand in hand with youth in the foster care system. This collaboration amongst those partners has really allowed us to share monthly groups, summer camps, open up internal trainings for youth and CASA advocates. And so overall, it's strengthened our program. There's a close communication and familiarity with our regional staff to youth who are transitioning at a much younger age. And so overall, we've seen higher levels of engagement, stronger relationships. Typically, those introductions begin as young as the age of 14 or 15. This has really proven to be effective in far more than just our outcomes and performance. But as Megan and Taylor want to share some real life examples, you will see that some of the above points and then key aspects that Kelsey hit on during her presentation will kind of translate into experiences and questions that you are all likely experiencing and going through right now. So I'm going to hand it over, and I apologize again for talking really fast, but to Taylor and Megan to talk probably about the most important part of today.
So Megan and I are going to introduce you to Savannah. So Savannah entered foster care at the age of 16 with her and her child. She was credit deficient in school and had dreams to become a hairdresser or a CNA. She was in an unhealthy relationship with her daughter's father and did not have the coping skills to deal with the stress of being a teen mom. She did not have a bank account or a driver's license and was in need of assistance with adulting skills such as budgeting, cooking, and household management. CASA also entered her life at 16, and some of the first topics that Savannah's CASA worked with her on were self-esteem building, healthy boundaries, managing her emotions at work, and reinforcing Savannah's positive traits and strengths. Her CASA spent a lot of time with her just listening to her talk about her struggles, and which helped work on building a strong foundation for them to continue to work on harder things.
So Savannah continued working with her CASA along with a team that included the county independent living coordinator, which not all counties have, but we're fortunate in our area to have one. The regional independent living coordinator and her CASA supervisor, and also her county social worker and her therapist. So together the team developed action plans that included which support person would assist Savannah with completing specific tasks to prepare her to age out of foster care, such as completing driver's education, signing up for health insurance, applying for housing, touring colleges, budgeting, and parenting. These meetings occurred monthly and tasks were adjusted as needed. And during this time, Savannah's CASA attended all meetings and made sure to advocate for Savannah to ensure that her voice was being heard and her needs were being met. Her CASA often encouraged Savannah to speak up and not just to do what the other adults in the meeting maybe seemed like they wanted her to do. She really advocated for her to tell the group what she was wanting to do. Her CASA also connected with independent living staff to make certain that she knew all of the services that independent living was able to offer to Savannah going forward. At 17 and a half, an ILTD meeting occurred. Savannah's CASA was present and came prepared to take notes and to continue moving forward on tasks and plans to help Savannah to age out of care. Savannah's CASA encouraged Savannah to develop a relationship with the regional independent living coordinator and to reach out on a regular basis. Specifically at this time, Savannah's CASA began discussing vehicle ownership and completed tasks such as explaining vehicle loan management, auto maintenance, and the importance of car insurance. She also took Savannah to multiple car lots to discuss important factors to consider while purchasing a vehicle. Savannah's CASA also assisted Savannah in looking at apartments. They discussed things like how to read a lease, how to clean an apartment, and how to communicate with landlords. Another task that was taken on by Savannah's CASA was budgeting to save for an apartment. And they got really creative with how they did this. They set up a system where Savannah's foster mom basically helped Savannah to mimic paying rent. So she would collect a payment from Savannah each month and would keep it in an envelope to later go into Savannah's savings account to assist her with having money saved for when she moved out and to practice being able to budget for that amount of money. And then her CASA just helped monitor that as a third party, just so that she had a lot of support in doing that. Thank you, Sarah. And when Savannah turned 18, graduated and aged out of care, her CASA continued to be a part of her life. Savannah signed a release of information to allow her CASA to continue to attend meetings with Savannah and her regional independent living worker to discuss plans to keep Savannah successful while living independently. Savannah was able to get an apartment with the assistance of a housing voucher. Although Savannah's regional independent living worker had facilitated the voucher application, Savannah's CASA advocate stayed involved throughout the entire process and helped Savannah to complete paperwork in a timely manner and help answer any questions that she may have along the way. During this time, Savannah also re-engaged in a relationship with her biological mother and struggled with some of the emotions that came along with this change. Savannah's CASA remained a constant support to her during this time and revisited conversations about boundaries and self-care that they had previously had as well. Savannah also began to put more effort into building a healthy relationship with the parent of her child. Savannah's CASA was able to support both of them and help Savannah to acknowledge and appreciate the positive changes and actions made by her child's father. Today, Savannah is 20 years old. She does still remain in contact with her CASA advocate and often refers to her as a grandmother figure in her life. They do see each other less frequently due to life being busy, but they do still remain in contact. Today, Savannah has her own apartment, has a vehicle, and was approved for a vehicle loan. So it was great that they did all of that car education together. It was like the most exciting phone call when she called to say that she had been approved for her very own car loan. She is employed full-time, and this fall she will be utilizing Brighter Star funding to attend college with hopes of working in social services.
So some tips for CASA when working with youth that are aging out of care: focus on building that relationship before working on the hard things. Focus on connecting with that youth and building trust before asking them to discuss personal and sometimes scary or intimidating topics. Start with small tasks and short-term goals and celebrate the little things. Meet the youth where they are at. Be aware of your own expectations. Sometimes youth will often strive to meet our expectations and it may not be what they truly want. There will be roadblocks. Life has curveballs, so try to stay engaged with the youth and supportive of them even when they're off track of their goals. Encourage youth to build their support system. So Savannah's CASA really worked with Savannah to make sure she was checking in with Megan and having that relationship with her. Each youth is different, so things will change as they get older. Every meeting will look different. Frequency and contact may be different by youth, and be creative on how you communicate and utilize your support system. So utilize your supervisor and independent living staff. And I think now we can answer questions.
I know that was a lot of information. Really quickly, I will reach out following this presentation to see if I can share a PDF of this presentation as well to pass that on. But if there are any specific questions, Taylor and Megan are the experts here, so take advantage of a couple minutes with them.
Can you speak to the voluntary aspect and some of the tricks of the trade to help engage youth who are reluctant, basically?
Mm-hmm. I think, I mean, as you know, it depends on the kid. But I think kind of going back to what Sarah had said earlier, we've been really successful in Brown County by starting that early engagement so that when that ILTD meeting hits, it's not another new person coming into their life. I know I sometimes get kids transferred in from other counties who are meeting me really last minute, and it's super hard to engage with them. I do try to be really creative in my contact methods, and I'm sure Taylor can speak to this as well, but you know, social media, if you can find them on there, texting, calling, email, talking to their school staff, just being able to get in front of them to make that connection has been the biggest thing for me. I've also gotten really lucky that here in Brown County, we have really great CASA staff, but we also have some really great CASA advocates. So them just being able to loop me into the conversation, bringing me up in conversations with the kids, making sure I'm in meetings, even if they're just grabbing coffee with a kid, you know, shooting me a text and email and saying, hey, Megan, we're doing this at this time. Do you want to come meet us? I think more of that casual setting, sometimes outside of the big meetings, can be super effective to get the young adults to be more comfortable. A lot of kids, when they age out of care, are ready to be done with staff. They're sick of other people managing their lives. So if I can make that comfortable relationship that a lot of the CASA advocates have with their kids, it seems to really help us be able to stay connected.
One thing I'll say too is a young person is eligible up to 21 or 23 for Brighter Star. If they choose not to engage right away after leaving care, that's okay. They can come back so long as they're not too old for services. So there's a risk with that, right? That they sort of disappear into the wind, but it's the acknowledgement that like maybe they do just need to disengage for 6 months or a year or something and sort of come back on their own timeline. So that's an option too, as long as they know sort of who to go back to.
So what's the most frequent way of getting reentry after a lapse like that? Is it the higher ed institutions, or how are they getting back in?
I think, go ahead, Taylor.
Brown County, sometimes they actually call their CASA and then we connect them to Megan and Macy, her counterpart. So sometimes it is just reaching out to that familiar face and then we just direct them on where to go.
Yeah, and it's absolutely sometimes that they do want to go to school and they're talking to their CASA about that, or calling Taylor directly and talking about those kind of things. Sometimes it's a crisis, and then since their CASAs have met us, they're like, oh, this sounds like a great opportunity to reach out to Megan or Macy. So yeah, it's usually a life event. They reach out to the people that they know and trust, which is why it's great that we have the connection with CASA, and then can get routed back to us.
I think one thing too, just because you had mentioned post-secondary and training providers, there are foster youth contacts at every single UW and technical school. And so frequently, if there is a student that marks that independent eligibility status on their FAFSA, that contact person receives that application and they'll reach out to their regional provider and say, hey, are they eligible for Brighter Star? Are they receiving IL services right now? And if they're not, we'll get them connected. So that is, I think, one of our biggest referral points of contact as well, too.
Excuse me, I have a case that went through foster care for at least 2 years, but it led to adoption. Does this transition program relate to children that have been adopted through the system?
It depends, and that's something that you can reach out to me directly. I'll put my email in the chat, but it depends. So if they were adopted after 16 and they've had that out-of-home care experience, then yes, they should qualify, but we always want to look at each situation individually to make sure we're advising properly. So feel free to reach out to me directly and I can consult with you a little bit more on that. Hope that helps a little bit.
Well, I think that's time for today. I know we went over a couple minutes, but I really wanted to thank each and every one of our presenters. So much information shared today. Thank you. Thank you. The other thing is participants, if your name is different on Zoom than the name that you registered with, we are sending out certificates of completion. So if it shows iPhone, we're not going to know who you are. So if you could either put in the chat box or send me an email. I'm the one that sent you the Zoom information. Send me an email that you participated and we'll make sure that you get a certificate. Other than that, you are all free to go. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.